She was 21 years old, and she owned nothing but a canvas bag she had sewn herself and the clothes on her back, and $10 folded 3 times at the bottom of that bag. Her name was Willa Grace Thornhill, and she had been standing in the rain outside the apartment building on Mercer Street in Lowell, Massachusetts for 20 minutes, watching the locksmith change the locks on the door to the only home she had known for the last 3 years. The rain was cold, March rain, the kind that comes sideways and gets inside your collar no matter how you stand. Willa's wool cardigan, the one her mother had knit the winter before the sickness came, was soaked through at the shoulders. Her boots were soaked through at the laces. Her hair was plastered to her face in dark, wet strands, and she did not bother to push it back. The locksmith did not look at her. He was a young man, maybe 25, with a Red Sox cap pulled low and a tool belt that jangled when he moved. He worked quickly and did not meet her eyes, and when he was finished, he tested the new lock twice and then walked past her to his truck without saying a word. He had been paid to do a job, and he had done it. And what happened to the girl standing in the rain was not his concern. Willa stayed where she was. She was not waiting for anything in particular. She was simply standing in a place she had stood 1,000 times before and trying to understand that she would not stand there again. The building was 3 stories of red brick with iron fire escapes that climbed the front like black veins. She had lived on the 2nd floor in a narrow apartment above a laundromat that had closed 2 years ago and been replaced by a vape shop whose neon sign buzzed through the floor at night in a way that made it hard to sleep. The apartment had belonged to her mother first. Ruth Thornhill had rented it in the spring of 2008 when Willa was 3 years old and Ruth was newly widowed and working 2 jobs to keep them both fed. Ruth had been a seamstress, not the kind who worked in a shop with a sign and regular hours, but the kind who took in mending from the church ladies in the funeral parlor across the river and hemmed bridesmaid dresses in the kitchen at midnight while Willa slept in the next room. Ruth had learned to sew from her own mother, a woman named Moira Sullivan, who had worked the garment trade in the Irish Quarter of South Boston in the 1950s and had raised 3 daughters on a single Singer sewing machine and a stubborn refusal to ask for help from anyone. Moira had died before Willa was born, but the Singer machine had come to Ruth, and Ruth had used it to mend what other people had given up on. She could blind stitch a hem so that the thread disappeared into the fabric. She could save a button by sewing it back through the old hole so it sat exactly where the coat remembered it. She could patch a child's winter jacket with scraps from the remnant bin so carefully that the patches looked like they had always been there. Willa's father had been a fisherman named Owen Thornhill. He had worked the boats out of Gloucester, mostly on a dragger called the Atlantic Promise that ran deep water trips to Georgia Bank in weather that kept other boats in harbor. He had met Ruth at a church social in 2001, married her the following spring, and brought her back to Lowell to live in the narrow apartment above the laundromat on Mercer Street. He was gone 3 weeks at a time, and home for 1. When he was home, the apartment smelled like diesel and salt, and the strong black coffee he made on the stove in a tin pot his own father had given him before he shipped out the first time. When Willa was 9 years old, The Atlantic Promise did not come back from a February trip, and a man in a Coast Guard uniform stood on their porch with a folded paper, and a voice so quiet Willa had to lean forward to hear him. After that, it was just Willa and Ruth above the laundromat, and the only thing Willa had of her father was a brass compass on a brass chain that had been in the pocket of the jacket he left behind. The compass was old, older than her father. On the back, in small letters scratched by hand, it said OT to WG, and below that, chart your own course. Ruth did not remarry. She kept sewing. She took on more work to cover what Owen had brought home from the boats. She taught Willa to thread a needle and to iron a seam flat, and to save fabric scraps because you never knew when you would need a patch. She kept a tin box on the kitchen windowsill labeled in pencil. For the month after this one, and into it she dropped whatever coins were left at the end of each week. Sometimes $1, sometimes only a quarter. And when the electric bill came due in January or the rent came due in March, there was always just enough. She kept a second list taped to the inside of the kitchen cupboard door. It was a list of everyone who had ever done them a kindness. The neighbor who lent them a space heater the winter the building heat failed. The diner owner who sent home day-old bread in a paper sack. The old woman at St. Michael's who passed them a winter coat for Willa one October, with no questions asked and no names exchanged. Ruth wrote the names down in careful script, so she would remember to repay the kindnesses if she ever could. And so Willa would grow up knowing that a debt of gratitude was the only kind of debt worth keeping careful books on. Ruth got sick when Willa was 17. A slow sickness at first, a cough that would not leave, a tiredness that lived in her bones. By the time the clinic in Lowell finally gave it a name, there was very little the doctors could do. Willa left her senior year of high school in the spring to sit beside her mother's bed and read aloud from a book of Irish folktales that Ruth had kept on the shelf since her own girlhood. Ruth died on a Tuesday morning in April, when Willa was 18 years old. The rent was due on Friday. Willa did what her mother had taught her to do, which was to go to work. She got a job bussing tables at an Irish diner called Clover and Thistle on Route 3, where a woman named Nell Patterson ran the kitchen with her sleeves rolled and her iron gray hair pinned up in a thick braid. Nell was 59 years old and had been running the diner alone for 11 years, since her husband died of a heart attack, loading trucks at the Cisco depot. She did not hire Willa out of pity. She hired her because Willa had shown up on a Thursday afternoon with clean boots and a firm handshake and had asked for any work inside or outside that Nell had to give. Nell watched her for an hour. Then she offered her the busser shift and a plate of eggs and brown bread for free. Willa also cleaned rooms at a motel off the interstate where the owner paid cash and asked no questions. For nearly 3 years, she kept her head down, and she kept the apartment above the laundromat, even as the rent climbed and the landlord changed hands twice, and the laundromat downstairs became the vape shop with the buzzing neon sign. She saved what she could. She dropped coins into her own version of her mother's tin box. She added names to her own version of her mother's list. Nell Patterson was the first name on it. In February of her 21st year, the building was sold again, this time to a developer out of Boston who specialized in converting old residential buildings into short-term vacation rentals for people who wanted to visit Lowell for the weekend and see the historic mills and the canals, and then leave again on Sunday evening. The developer sent a letter in a flat white envelope. Willa found it taped to her apartment door when she came home from her shift at the motel. The tape was the kind that leaves a sticky residue on paint. The letter said in one short paragraph with no greeting and no signature at the top, "Notice of termination of tenancy. This building is being converted to short-term rentals effective March 30th. You have until that date to vacate the premises. No extensions will be granted. No forwarding address will be maintained. Please leave your keys on the kitchen counter upon departure." There was a printed name at the bottom, Gerald Fisk, and a phone number for a property management company in Quincy. Willa read the letter twice. She tried the building's front door to make sure the locks had not already been changed. They had not. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time looking at the photograph on her dresser. It was a picture of her mother and father standing in front of a fishing boat at the Gloucester docks when Willa was 4. Her mother's tin box was still on the kitchen windowsill. It had $6.80 in it. She spent the next month doing what her mother would have told her to do. She sold the Singer sewing machine to a woman in Chelmsford who collected vintage machines for $80. She sold the kitchen table and the 2 matching chairs and the small lamp with the pleated shade to a second-hand furniture store on the edge of town for $45 more. She gave her mother's book of Irish folk tales to Nell at the diner because Nell had always asked about the stories and because Willa could not bear to sell it to a stranger. On the last day, she packed 2 changes of clothes, the wool cardigan her mother had knit the photograph of her parents at the Gloucester docks, and her father's brass compass on its brass chain into the canvas shoulder bag she had sewn herself the summer after her mother died. She slept 2 nights in the back booth of Clover and Thistle. Nell did not charge her for coffee and brought her a plate of eggs and home fries each morning without being asked. On the 3rd morning, Nell slid a folded newspaper across the counter and tapped a small notice near the bottom of the classifieds with one short finger. Her fingernails were trimmed flat and clean the way a cook's nails always are. "Look at this one," Nell said. Willa looked. It was a notice from a county clerk's office in a place called Pembroke County on the coast of Maine. It listed 6 abandoned properties being sold for nominal fees to clear them off the tax rolls and make room in the county records for buildings that still had a use. There was an old Grange Hall, a 1-room post office, a fire lookout tower, a salt shed, a barn on a hayfield, and at the bottom of the list an old ferry house on a stretch of cove called Harlow Cove, with a note that said it had been closed since the Pembroke Bridge opened in 1963. Price $10. A ferry house, Willa said. Nell nodded. She was wiping down the counter with a damp rag even though the counter was already clean. "Up in Maine," she said. "I used to know someone up that way. Long time ago. Before my husband. Before the diner." The whole county was nothing but pine trees and lobster boats and the kind of quiet that gives things back to you if you stand still long enough. She paused. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron and took out a folded $20 bill and pressed it into Willa's hand, along with the newspaper. Her hand was warm and rough and steady. 10 for the building, Nell said. 10 for the road. And you call me when you get there, so I know you are alive. Do you hear me? Willa nodded. She could not speak for a moment. She put the 20 in the front pocket of her canvas bag where she would not forget it, and where it would not fall out if the zipper broke. Then she folded the newspaper carefully and put it in the bag as well. The bus from Lowell to Portland took 7 hours. It left at 6 in the morning and traveled north through towns whose names Willa had never heard. Nashua, Manchester, Concord, Augusta. The land grew hillier and the trees grew thicker, and the houses grew farther apart until there were long stretches where there were no houses at all, only forest and the occasional gas station or roadside fruit stand, shuttered for the winter. In Portland, she transferred to a smaller bus that ran northeast along the coast through Freeport and Brunswick and Bath and Rockland. Each town was smaller than the last. By the time the bus reached the turnoff for Pembroke County, it was late afternoon, and Willa was the only passenger left. The driver let her off at a gravel crossroads, where 2 narrow roads met under a stand of white pines that had been there longer than the roads had. He pointed down the road that ran toward the water. "County office is 2 miles down," he said. "White building with a sign. Ferry house is another 3 miles past that if you are going all the way." Willa thanked him. The bus pulled away and left her standing in the gravel with her canvas bag, and the smell of pine sap and salt air so strong it made her eyes water. It was early March, and the weather in coastal Maine was different from the weather in Lowell. Colder, wetter. The kind of cold that came off the ocean and settled into your chest and stayed there. She started walking. The road bent around a curve, and then the land fell away, and there was the ocean. Willa had never seen the ocean from the land before. Her father had worked it, and her father had died in it. But she had never stood on the shore and looked out at the gray water stretching away to the horizon like a living thing. It was not blue the way she had imagined. It was gray, the color of wet slate, the color of old iron. Gulls wheeled low over the surface, and their cries were sharp and wild and sounded like grief. She walked another mile, and the road turned inland again through a stretch of black spruce and bare birch. And then it opened up into a small cluster of buildings that might have been called a town, if you were generous. There was a post office, a general store with a rusted Pepsi sign, a white clapboard church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left, and at the end of the road a single-story building with a hand-painted sign that said, "Pembroke County Clerk." Willa pushed open the door. Inside it was warm and smelled like old paper and wood smoke. A woman in her 60s sat behind a wooden counter with a mug of tea and a crossword puzzle folded open in front of her. She looked up when Willa came in, and her expression did not change toward pity, or toward suspicion. She simply looked at Willa the way you look at anyone who has just walked a long way in the cold. "You are here about the Ferry house," the woman said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." The woman nodded. She set down her pen and stood up. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of build that comes from a lifetime of hard work, and her hands were large and capable. Her hair was steel gray and pulled back in a tight braid, and she wore a wool sweater that had been mended at the elbows. "My name is Ida Shaw," the woman said. "Ida Marlowe Shaw. I have been the county clerk here for 42 years. My mother was the clerk before me and my grandmother before her. I know every building in Pembroke County, and I know every person who ever lived in them, and I know which ones are worth saving and which ones are not." She paused and looked at Willa for a long moment. Then she said, "The Ferry house has been locked and empty since 1963. The roof is partly gone. There is no power. The well has not been tested in 60 years. It is 4 miles from the nearest paved road and 6 miles from the nearest grocery store. The county is selling it for $10 because it is not worth the cost of tearing it down." "Yes, ma'am," Willa said. "I have $10. Ida looked at her a moment longer. Then she turned and pulled a heavy leather-bound deed book from the shelf behind her and opened it to a page that had been marked with a slip of paper. She turned the book around so Willa could see it. "Sign here," Ida said, "and here, and here." Willa signed her name, Willa Grace Thornhill, in the careful script her mother had taught her. She placed the $10 bill on the counter. It was one of the 2 bills Nell had given her, and it felt like the heaviest thing she had ever held. Ida picked it up and folded it once and tucked it into a metal cash box, and then stamped the deed with a brass stamp that made a soft, flat sound like a door closing. "It is yours," Ida said. She looked at Willa, and there was something in her expression that Willa could not read. Not pity, not curiosity. Something else. Something older and sadder and more complicated. "You know who the last person to live in that house was," Ida said. Willa shook her head. "My grandfather," Ida said. "Silas Cade Marlowe. He ran the ferry from 1901 until 1963. 62 years. When the bridge opened up the coast and the county told him the ferry would not run anymore, he moved into the back room of the ferry house, and he lived there alone for the last year of his life. He had no children, no family except me and my brother, and he had not spoken to either of us in 20 years because of reasons I will not bore you with. When he died, he left everything to the county, and he left a letter saying the ferry house should go to whoever needed it most." Ida paused. She reached under the counter and pulled out a set of keys on a steel ring. "The county has been trying to sell that building for 61 years, Ida said. "You are the first person to buy it, so either you need it very badly, or you are a fool. I am going to assume it is the first one, and I am going to drive you down there because that rain will kill you before you get there on foot." Willa looked down at the keys in her hand. They were old, heavy, the kind of keys that opened doors that had been closed a long time. "Thank you," Willa said. Do not thank me yet, Ida said. They drove in Ida's truck, a Ford Ranger with 200,000 miles on it, and a cracked windshield that had been cracked so long, Ida did not see it anymore. They drove back the way Willa had walked, and then turned off onto a narrow gravel road that wound through the pines and down toward the water. The road ended at a spit of land that jutted out into a wide cove, and at the end of that spit stood the Ferry house. It was a 2-story building of weathered cedar shingles gone silver gray from a lifetime of salt wind. The roof was peaked, and there was a square structure rising from the center like a crow's nest on a ship. A covered porch wrapped around the seaward side. The windows were boarded with plywood that had gone soft at the edges. Above the door hung a faded wooden sign that said, Harlow Cove Ferry, established 1901. A rusted orange life ring hung by one frayed rope from a nail beside the door. Below the building, an old ferry slip sloped into the water. The pilings were green with weed and barnacle, and the wooden planks were warped and split. Gulls stood on the pilings and watched them with hard black eyes. Ida pulled the truck up to the front of the building and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Ida reached into the back seat and pulled out a canvas tote bag. There is a cot in the back room if the mice have not claimed it, Ida said. Kerosene lantern on the shelf. Matches in the tin. I will come back tomorrow with some things. She handed Willa the bag. Inside were a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, 3 apples, a thermos of hot tea, and a wool blanket that smelled like cedar. Willa looked at her. Why are you helping me? Ida was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Because my grandfather left that house for someone who needed it. And I think you need it. And because I have spent 61 years being angry at a dead man for leaving me out of his will. And I am tired of being angry. She paused. Then she said, There is something you should know. When you sign those papers, you take your father's compass out to do it. Willa nodded slowly. Let me see it. Willa reached into her bag and pulled out the brass compass on its chain. Ida took it and turned it over in her large hands. She looked at the inscription on the back. OT to WG. Chart your own course. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, My grandfather made this. I remember it. He made compasses by hand in the winter when the ferry was not running. This one he gave to a young man who worked on the fishing boats in the summer of 1959. A deckhand named Owen Thornhill. Your father. Willa felt something shift in her chest. You knew my father. I was a girl, Ida said, but I remember him. He used to ride the ferry every morning that summer. My grandfather liked him. They would stand at the wheel and talk about the weather and the tides, and my grandfather would show him how to read the current. When your father left at the end of the summer, my grandfather gave him this compass and he told him to always find his way home. Ida handed the compass back to Willa. So, you see, she said, you did not buy that house by accident. You bought it because it was waiting for you. She started the truck and Willa got out. The rain had stopped, but the air was cold and damp, and the wind coming off the water cut through her wet cardigan like a blade. Ida leaned out the window. "One more thing," she said. "There are things you need to know about my grandfather, about why he left that money. But not today. Today you need a fire and a dry place to sleep." She put the truck in reverse, and then she paused. "I have not been inside that building since my grandfather's funeral in 1964, Ida said. "Some doors you have to open yourself." Then she drove away and Willa was alone. She stood in front of the Ferry house and looked at it. The building was larger up close than it had seemed from the road. The cedar shingles were silver and soft with age, and the porch sagged slightly in the middle, but the structure itself looked sound. She walked up the 3 wooden steps to the porch and put the key in the lock. The lock was stiff, and it took both hands to turn it. But when it finally gave, the door swung open on hinges that did not squeak. Inside, the air was cold and still and smelled like old wood and tar and the faint mineral ghost of seawater. The front room was the old passenger waiting area. A long wooden bench ran along one wall. A pot-bellied stove sat in the corner, its black iron surface dull with dust. A ticket window with a wooden shutter pulled down stood against the far wall. The floorboards were wide pine scuffed to a soft gray where 60 years of feet had shuffled across them, waiting for the boat that no longer came. Willa set her bag down on the bench. She felt something in her chest that she had not felt in a long time, which was the feeling of not being afraid of the next hour. She found the kerosene lantern on a shelf beside the ticket window, and the box of matches in a tin exactly where Ida had said they would be. She struck a match, and the smell of sulfur filled the room, and then the lantern caught and a small yellow flame grew inside the glass chimney. She adjusted the wick, and the flame steadied and threw warm light across the waiting room. She walked slowly through the building by the lantern light. The back room had the cot Ida had mentioned, and a small iron stove, and a shelf with 3 tin cups, and a chipped enamel basin. A narrow wooden staircase in the corner climbed to the 2nd floor. Willa climbed the stairs. They creaked under her weight, but they held. The 2nd floor was a single long room with windows on 3 sides and the square wheelhouse structure rising above it at the far end. In the wheelhouse were the old ferry controls. A wooden wheel, its spokes worn smooth by hands. A brass throttle lever green with verdigris. A speaking tube. And against the forward wall beneath the windows, a tall cabinet of dark oak built into the wall itself. The cabinet was the compass binnacle, the housing where the ferry's magnetic compass had sat in its gimbaled mount so the helmsman could steer a straight course, even when the boat rocked in the waves. The glass dome on top was cracked but intact. Below it, the cabinet had 2 small doors held shut by a brass hasp and a tiny padlock the size of a walnut corroded green with age. Willa knelt in front of it. She set the lantern on the floor beside her. The padlock came apart in her fingers at the first pull, the old metal crumbling like dried bread. She opened the doors. Inside the cabinet, beneath the compass mount, was a flat wooden drawer fitted snug into the bottom of the housing. She slid it out. It moved with the slow resistance of wood that had been closed a very long time. The drawer was lined with faded green felt. Inside it was an oilcloth bundle and a stack of envelopes tied with a ribbon that had once been blue but had faded to the color of winter sky. Willa carried the drawer down to the waiting room where the light from the lantern was steadier. She set it on the bench beside her bag. She untied the oilcloth first. Inside were bundled banknotes, old United States currency. Some of the large format bills from before 1929. Some newer but still old. The paper yellowed and soft. All of them in careful stacks held together with paper bands that had crumbled at the edges. She counted slowly. 20s, 50s. A small stack of hundreds. When she was done counting and recounting and counting a third time, to be sure she sat very still on the bench. The total was $11,460. She set the money aside and picked up the stack of envelopes. There were 8 of them. The top envelope was larger than the others, and the paper was thin and fragile, and the ink had turned brown with age, but the handwriting was clear and even. The hand of a man who had written many letters in his life. On the front of the envelope, in that same careful script, it said, "To whoever finds this." Willa opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. She unfolded it and held it close to the lantern light and began to read. "To whoever finds this. My name is Silas Cade Marlowe. I have been the ferryman at Harlow Cove from 1901 until today. My father, Declan Marlowe, kept this boat before me from 1884 until 1901, and his hands built the slip you are standing on and the pilings you see in the water below. Together we carried the people of this county across this cove for 62 years. Today the new bridge 3 miles north opens to traffic, and the county has informed me that the ferry will not run again after Friday. I am 68 years old. My wife Anne passed in 1960 of a sickness the doctors in Bangor could not name. We were not given children. There is no one to pass this work to, and the building will be locked and forgotten when I turn the key for the last time on Friday evening. I have saved a portion of every fare I ever took for a thing. I called my waiting fund because a ferryman spends his life waiting. Waiting for the tide. Waiting for the fog to lift. Waiting for the last passenger on the last run. I meant the fund for a proper retirement that I now find I do not want. I am leaving it here in the compass cabinet because I believe that one day someone will come to this building who needs a beginning the way I once needed one. I came to this cove in 1901 with nothing but a bad suit and my father's name. The ferry gave me a life. Let it give you one too. Be kind to the building. Be kind to the cove. The gulls remember. The tide remembers. A waiting place is a kind of faith, and faith does not break just because the boat has stopped running. There are 7 more envelopes in this drawer. They are numbered 2 through 8. Open them in order. Do not rush. The ferry house will tell you when. Yours truly, Silas Cade Marlowe, ferryman, Harlow Cove, Maine. June 1963. Willa sat on the bench in the yellow lantern light and read the letter twice and then a third time. She did not cry. Her mother had taught her that tears were a private weather and not always the right answer to a gift. She folded the letter carefully along its old creases and placed it back in its envelope. She looked at the other 7 envelopes still tied with their faded ribbon. They were smaller than the first. Each one had a number written on the front in the same careful hand. Number 2. Number 3. All the way to number 8. On the front of the second envelope it said, "For the daughter of the sea." Willa's hand went to the compass around her neck. She pulled it out from under her wet cardigan and looked at it. OT to WG. Chart your own course. Her father's compass, made by the hands of Silas Cade Marlowe in a winter 65 years ago. She set the envelope aside. She would open it. But not tonight. Tonight she needed to build a fire and eat the bread and peanut butter Ida had given her and sleep in a dry place for the first time in 3 days. She carried her bag to the back room and found the cot and the small iron stove. There was wood stacked beside the stove, old and dry and split into pieces the size of her forearm. She opened the stove door and laid a fire the way her mother had taught her. Paper first if you had it, then kindling, then the larger pieces laid in across so the air could move between them. She struck a match and held it to the paper, and the fire caught and grew. The stove began to warm the room. Willa sat on the cot and unwrapped the bread and opened the jar of peanut butter and ate slowly, tearing off pieces of bread and dipping them in the peanut butter. Because she had no knife, the bread was good. Fresh. Baked that morning, probably. When she was finished, she drank the tea from the thermos and it was still warm and tasted like honey and something else she could not name. She wrapped herself in the wool blanket Ida had given her and lay down on the cot. The mattress was thin and the springs creaked, but it was better than the booth at the diner. Through the window she could see the last light fading from the sky over the cove. The gulls had settled for the night. The tide was going out and she could hear the water pulling away from the pilings below the ferry slip. A soft sucking sound like breath. She thought about her mother Ruth, who had kept a list of kindnesses on the inside of a cupboard door, and who had taught her daughter that a debt of gratitude was the only kind of debt worth keeping. She thought about her father Owen, who had crossed an ocean of water every day on a ferry run by a man named Silas Marlowe, and who had been given a compass with the instruction to always find his way home. She thought about Silas Marlowe himself, a man she had never met, who had spent 62 years carrying people across a stretch of water, and who had saved every nickel and dime so that one day a stranger could have a beginning. She understood now that she had not found this place by accident, that Nell Patterson had not given her the newspaper by accident, that her father's compass had not survived 30 years in a drawer by accident. Some things were accidents and some things were not, and the ferry house was not. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 3 years, she was not afraid of tomorrow. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she would be here to meet it, and that was enough. Outside, the gulls called once more in the darkness, and the tide continued its slow retreat, and the ferry house stood at the end of its gravel spit and waited the way it had been waiting for 61 years for the next person who would need it. In the morning, Willa woke to pale gray light coming through the window and the sound of rain on the roof. She lay still for a moment, disoriented, and then she remembered where she was. The fire in the stove had gone out during the night, and the room was cold, but not unbearably so. She sat up and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and looked out the window. The cove was gray and flat under the rain. Mist hung low over the water, and she could not see the far shore. A single gull stood on one of the pilings below the ferry slip, its feathers ruffled against the wind, and it looked like the loneliest thing she had ever seen. She got up and rekindled the fire and warmed her hands over the stove. She ate an apple from Ida's bag and drank the last of the tea, cold now, but still sweet. Then she pulled on her damp cardigan and went upstairs to the wheelhouse. The 7 envelopes were still on the bench where she had left them. She picked up the second one, the one that said, "For the daughter of the sea," and turned it over in her hands. The paper was the same thin, fragile stalk as the first letter. The handwriting was the same. She sat down on the bench and opened it. The letter inside was dated 1 day earlier than the first. June 13th, 1963. To the daughter of the sea. If you are reading this, then your father told you about me, or you are wearing the compass I gave him in the summer of 1959. Owen Thornhill came to Harlow Cove that summer, 20 years old, working as a deckhand on a dragger called the Sea Harvest. He rowed my ferry every morning for 3 months. We did not talk much at first. I am not a man of many words, and neither was he. But over time we spoke about the weather, about the tides, about the way the water changes color before a storm, about patience. He told me about your mother, Ruth, the girl he was gonna marry, the seamstress from Lowell with hands that could mend anything. He said he was afraid he was not good enough for her. I told him that a good man does not need to be perfect. He only needs to know the way home. When he left at the end of that summer, I gave him the compass. I had made it myself that winter. I told him to keep it close and to remember that the ocean does not care if you are good enough. It only cares if you respect it. Your mother, Anne, died in April of 1960. Owen sent me a letter of condolence. It was the only letter I kept after she passed. He wrote, "You taught me patience, but you did not teach me how to forgive the people who cannot wait. I hope you find a way." I did not find a way, but if you are here holding this letter, holding that compass, then you are the answer. I never wrote back to Owen, the daughter of the man who understood me when no one else did. There are 6 more letters in that drawer. Do not open them all at once. Open them when you need them. The ferry house will tell you when. Welcome home, daughter of the sea. Silas Cade Marlowe. Willa read the letter 3 times. She sat very still on the bench with the rain drumming on the roof above her and the wind rattling the boarded windows, and she felt the weight of something she could not name. Not sadness exactly. Not joy. Something in between. The feeling of being seen by someone you never met. The feeling of being expected. Her father had known Silas Marlowe. had ridden his ferry, had talked to him about patience and about the ocean and about her mother. And Silas had remembered, had kept Owen's letter for 3 years after his wife died, had made this compass with his own hands and given it to a 20-year-old deckhand with the instruction to find his way home. And now, 45 years later, that deckhand's daughter was sitting in the ferry house her father had once crossed every morning, holding a letter written to her before she was born. She folded the letter and put it back in its envelope and set it beside the first one. She looked at the other 6 envelopes, each one numbered and waiting. She wanted to open them all. She wanted to know what they said. But Silas had been clear. Open them when you need them. The ferry house will tell you when. She stood up and walked to the window. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming on the porch roof below and running in streams down the boarded glass. She could hear it filling the gutters and overflowing and splashing onto the ground. The ferry slip below was slick and black with water, and the pilings gleamed like polished bone. This was her house now, her ferry house, bought for $10 and left to her by a man who had been dead for 61 years. A man who had known her father. A man who had loved his wife and lost her, and lived alone in this building for a year waiting for the right person to find what he had left behind. She thought about what Ida had said. Some doors you have to open yourself. Willa went back downstairs and put on her boots. They were still damp from yesterday, but they were the only boots she had. She opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The rain hit her face and soaked through her cardigan in seconds. But she did not go back inside. She walked down the 3 wooden steps and stood in the gravel and looked at the building. It needed work. That much was obvious. The roof over the wheelhouse was partly gone, just as Ida had said. She could see daylight through a gap where the shingles had blown away. The porch sagged in the middle, and several of the boards were soft with rot. The boarded windows would need to come down, and new glass would need to go in. The well behind the building would need to be tested. The stove would need its flue cleaned. There was a lifetime of work here if she wanted to do it right. But the bones of the building were good. The cedar shingles were weathered but not rotted. The foundation was solid. The door hung straight on its hinges. This was a building that had been built to last, and it had lasted, and it would last longer if someone cared for it. Willa walked around to the back of the building. There was a small shed with a rusted metal roof, and inside the shed was a hand pump mounted over a stone well. She worked the pump handle up and down. It was stiff and it squeaked, but after a dozen strokes, water began to spill out clear and cold, and tasting faintly of iron. She cupped her hands under the flow and drank, and the water was so cold it made her teeth ache. She walked down to the ferry slip. The wooden planks were slippery with rain and green weed, and she had to move carefully to keep from falling. At the end of the slip, she stood and looked out at the cove. The rain had turned the water the color of gunmetal, and the mist hung so low she could not see the far shore or the bridge that had put the ferry out of business. She could only see the gray water and the rain falling on it, and the gulls wheeling through the mist like ghosts. This was the view her father had seen every morning in the summer of 1959. This was the water he had crossed twice a day, standing at the rail of Silas Marlowe's ferry, learning patience, learning how to read the tides, learning how to respect the ocean. And this was the place Silas had loved enough to spend 62 years of his life, carrying people back and forth across a stretch of water that was no more than half a mile wide. Not because the work was easy, not because it made him rich, but because a waiting place was a kind of faith, and faith does not break just because the boat stops running. Willa turned and walked back up the slip to the ferry house. She went inside and took off her wet boots and hung her cardigan over the back of a chair near the stove to dry. She built up the fire and sat on the cot and pulled the wool blanket around her shoulders. She had $11,460. She had a ferry house. She had her father's compass and 2 letters from a dead ferryman, and 6 more letters waiting to be opened when she needed them. She had a bag of clothes and a photograph of her parents and the skills her mother had taught her, and the memory of her father's voice telling her to chart her own course. It was not much, but it was more than she had 3 days ago, and it was enough to start. She sat on the cot and listened to the rain on the roof and the fire crackling in the stove, and she thought about what came next. She would need to make a list. She would need to prioritize. Roof first, then windows, then the well, then the stove. She would need to learn how to do things she had never done before. How to shingle a roof, how to glaze a window, how to bank a fire so it would hold through the night. She would need help. She did not know anyone in Harlow Cove except Ida Shaw, and she did not know if Ida would come back or if yesterday had been a one-time kindness. But she would find out. And if Ida did not come back, Willa would walk to town and introduce herself to the people at the general store and the post office and the church. And she would ask for work and for advice and for the names of people who knew how to fix old buildings. Her mother had taught her that a debt of gratitude was worth keeping careful books on. Willa would start a new list. She would write down every person who helped her and every kindness they offered, and she would find a way to repay them if she could. Not with money necessarily, but with work, with time, with the same kind of quiet help they had given her. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and the tide continued its slow rhythm, and the ferry house stood at the end of its gravel spit and held her the way it had held Silas Marlowe and the way it had held her father all those years ago, when he was 20 years old and learning how to find his way home. Willa pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes, and for the first time since her mother died, she felt something that was not quite hope, but was close enough. She felt the possibility of a future, the possibility that she could build something here. Not just a roof or a window or a fire, but a life. The kind of life her father would have been proud of. The kind of life her mother would have recognized. The kind of life that Silas Marlowe had left $11,000 and 8 letters for, trusting that someday the right person would walk through the door and understand what a waiting place really meant. That person was Willa Grace Thornhill, 21 years old, orphaned, homeless 3 days ago, and now the keeper of a ferry house on the coast of Maine that had been waiting 61 years for her to arrive. She did not know it yet, but she would not be alone for long. The rebuilding began slowly, the way most important things begin. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with small, deliberate actions taken one after another until they accumulated into something that looked like progress. Willa spent the first week simply walking the ferry house in daylight, making notes in a small spiral notebook she had found in the general store in town. The notebook cost $1.50 and came with a pencil attached by a string. She wrote down everything that needed doing, and then she numbered the items in order of urgency. Water first, then shelter, then warmth. Everything else could wait. The well behind the building turned out to be sound. Ida Shaw came back on the third day just as she had promised, and she brought with her a man from the county health department named Carl Winters who tested the water and pronounced it safe to drink. The pump needed a new leather washer and some oil on the mechanism, but once Carl had fitted the new parts, the water ran clear and cold and tasted like iron and stone, and the deep places under the earth where water lives before it comes to the surface. Ida also brought a Coleman camp stove, a bag of groceries, a kerosene heater for the back room, and a stern warning about carbon monoxide poisoning. She showed Willa how to crack a window when running the heater, and how to check the flame color to make sure it was burning clean. Then she sat at the old ticket counter with a mug of tea and watched Willa work for a while without saying much of anything, which Willa appreciated more than she could say. On the fourth day, Willa walked into town and introduced herself at the general store. The owner was a man in his 70s named Albert Greer, who had run the store for 46 years, and who knew the name and business of every person within 20 miles. When Willa told him she had bought the ferry house, Albert looked at her for a long moment over the top of his reading glasses, and then he said, "Well, I will be damned. Somebody finally did it." He sold her a claw hammer and a handsaw, and a box of galvanized nails, and a bundle of cedar shingles at cost, which meant he was losing money on the deal. But he did it anyway because Albert Greer believed that a young person trying to fix up an old building deserved a fair shake. He also told her about a man named Caleb Shaw, who did carpentry work and who might be willing to take a look at the ferry house if Willa asked him politely. Caleb Shaw turned out to be Ida's older brother. He was 65 years old with hands like cured leather and a face that had seen 65 Maine winters and looked like it. He drove down to the ferry house on a Saturday morning in a pickup truck with a cracked tailgate and a toolbox in the bed that was older than Willa. He walked around the building without speaking, ran his hands along the door frame and the porch posts and the window sills, climbed a ladder to look at the roof, and then came back down and said, "You have got your work cut out for you." But he did not say it unkindly. He said it the way a doctor might tell you that you needed surgery but that you would probably survive. He quoted her a price for materials to fix the roof, and then he quoted her a second price for labor, and when Willa said she could not afford the labor, he nodded as if he had expected as much and said, "Then I will teach you to do it yourself," and he did. For 3 Saturdays in a row, Caleb Shaw came to the ferry house and showed Willa how to strip old shingles and how to lay new ones in overlapping rows so the water would run off instead of seeping in. He showed her how to cut shingles to fit around the wheelhouse and how to nail them down so they would not blow away in the first storm. He did not do the work for her. He stood beside her and watched her do it. And when she did it wrong, he told her so and showed her the right way, and then made her do it again until she got it right. His son Finn came with him on the second Saturday. Finn was 17, tall and thin, with his father's hands and his mother's quiet eyes. He did not talk much, but he was quick to learn and strong. And he helped Willa carry the bundles of shingles up the ladder to the roof without being asked. When they broke for lunch, Caleb produced sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and a thermos of coffee, and they sat on the porch and ate in silence, watching the gulls wheel over the cove. After lunch, Finn said, "My dad says your grandfather ran this ferry." Willa shook her head. "Not my grandfather. A man named Silas Marlowe. He knew my father a long time ago." Finn nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My dad knew him too. Silas. He used to ride the ferry when he was a kid. Said Silas never charged him the full fare because my dad's family was poor." Caleb did not look up from his sandwich, but Willa saw something shift in his expression. A tightening around the eyes, a softness in the set of his jaw. After a moment, he said, "Silas Marlowe was a hard man in some ways, but he was fair. And he remembered things. He remembered which families had money and which ones did not. And he adjusted the fares accordingly without making a show of it. My father rode that ferry for 40 years and never paid more than 3 cents. He paused. Then he said, "That is why I am here, teaching you how to fix his roof, because I owe him." Willa did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But she added Caleb Shaw's name to her list that night, the list she was keeping of people who had shown her kindness. Beside his name, she wrote, "Taught me to shingle a roof. Owes Silas. Fair man." By the end of May, the roof over the wheelhouse was sound. Willa had done most of the work herself, with Caleb watching and Finn helping to haul materials. And when the last shingle was nailed down and the ridge cap was sealed with tar, she stood back and looked at it and felt a pride she had not felt in a long time. It was not perfect. There were places where the raws did not line up quite straight, and places where she had driven a nail crooked and had to pull it out and start over. But it was tight. It would keep the rain out, and it would hold. Caleb inspected her work with the same deliberate care he had shown when he first arrived. He ran his hand along the shingles and tested the nails and checked the flashing around the wheelhouse, and then he nodded once and said, "That is a roof Silas Marlowe would approve of." It was the highest compliment he could have given her. In June, the windows came next. The plywood boards had to come down, and new glass had to go in, and Willa did not know how to glaze a window. So she asked Albert Greer at the general store if he knew anyone who did. Albert did not know anyone, but he knew someone who knew someone, which in a town the size of Harlow Cove was the same thing. The someone turned out to be a man named Fletcher Kane, who had worked as a glazier in Rockland for 30 years before retiring to a cottage on the south end of the cove. Fletcher was 62 years old and built like a man who had spent his life carrying heavy sheets of glass up flights of stairs. He had hands that moved with the precise economy of long practice and a voice that was rough from a lifetime of smoking cigarettes. He had quit 10 years ago, but whose damage was permanent. He came to the Ferry house on a Wednesday afternoon and looked at the windows and said, "I can do this for you, but it will cost." Willa told him she could pay for materials, but not for labor. Fletcher nodded and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your name is Thornhill, yes, sir. Any relation to Owen Thornhill, who worked the boats out of Gloucester? He was my father." Fletcher was quiet again. Then he said, "I knew your father, not well, but I knew him. He helped pull my cousin out of the water when his dragger went down off Provincetown in 2009. My cousin lived because of your father." He paused. Then he said, "I will do the windows for the cost of materials. You can pay me back by keeping this building standing." And so Fletcher Kane spent 2 weeks glazing the windows of the Ferry house. He taught Willa how to cut glass with a scoring tool and how to set the panes in putty and how to smooth the putty with a knife so it would seal against the weather. He worked slowly and carefully, and when he was finished, the windows were tight and clean and let in light the way windows should. Willa added his name to her list. Beside it, she wrote, "Glazed the windows. Cousin owes my father." Careful hands. It was Fletcher who told her about the lobsterman. "There is a man named Fletch Kane," he said. "No relation despite the name. He traps off the north end of the cove, leaves things sometimes. You will know what I mean when you see it." Willa did not understand until the following Tuesday when she found 2 lobsters in a bucket on her front porch. They were alive and their claws were banded, and there was no note. She looked around but saw no one. The next week there were 2 more, and the week after that another 2. It went on like this for a month before Willa finally saw the man who was leaving them. She was up early one morning hauling water from the well when a small boat motored into the cove and tied up at the old ferry slip. A man climbed out carrying a bucket. He was in his 60s, weathered and lean with the kind of tan that comes from a lifetime on the water. He walked up to the porch and set the bucket down and was turning to leave when Willa called out to him. The man stopped. He did not turn around. "Thank you," Willa said, "for the lobsters." The man stood there for a moment with his back to her. Then he said without turning, "My father rode Silas Marlowe's ferry for 41 years. Silas charged him 3 cents because my father was poor. 3 cents when everyone else paid a nickel. My father never forgot that." The man walked back to his boat and untied the line and motored away without saying anything else. Willa never learned his first name. She only knew him as Fletch Kane, no relation to Fletcher the glazier. And every Tuesday for the rest of that summer, he left 2 lobsters in a bucket on her porch and never stayed long enough for her to thank him properly. She added his name to her list. Beside it, she wrote, "Lobsters every Tuesday. Father rode the ferry. Remembers 3 cents." By the middle of July, the Ferry house was beginning to look like a place where Someone lived instead of a place that had been abandoned for 61 years. The roof was tight. The windows held glass. The well gave clean water. Willa had swept the waiting room floor and scrubbed the pot-bellied stove and cleaned the flue so it would draw properly. She had moved her few possessions into the back room and made it into something that resembled a bedroom. The photograph of her parents stood on the shelf above the cot. Her father's compass hung on a nail beside it. She had opened the third letter. It happened on a night in late July when the air was thick with heat, and the mosquitoes hummed outside the screens, and Willa could not sleep. She had been lying on the cot for 2 hours listening to the tide and thinking about money. She had spent nearly $8,000 of the $11,000 Silas had left her. Most of it had gone to materials, shingles and glass and putty and nails and tar, and the 100 other small things that added up faster than she had expected. She still needed a proper mattress. She needed a wood stove for winter that was better than the small iron stove in the back room. She needed firewood. She needed warmer clothes. She needed boots that did not leak. She got up and lit the kerosene lantern and climbed the stairs to the wheelhouse. The 6 remaining letters were in the compass cabinet where she had left them, still tied with their faded blue ribbon. She untied the ribbon and found the envelope marked with a number 3. On the front, in Silas Marlowe's careful script, it said, "When you doubt." She opened it. The letter inside was shorter than the first 2. It was dated June 15th, 1963. When you doubt, and you will doubt, because every person who has ever tried to build something from nothing has doubted, remember this. Anne told me before she died that a waiting place does not belong to us. We only keep it for the next person. You do not own the Ferry house. You keep it. Money does not make the Ferry house valuable. The people who wait make it valuable. I left you enough to begin, not enough to finish. Because if I gave you enough to finish, you would not need anyone. And a waiting place is not a place for one person. It is a place for a community. Ask for help. Accept help. Remember who helps. Pay it forward when you can. That is how a ferry works. Everyone pays their fare. Everyone gets across. SCM. Willa read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it back in its envelope and sat on the floor of the wheelhouse with her back against the compass cabinet and looked out at the dark water of the cove. Silas was right. She had been doubting. She had been lying awake doing math in her head and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake buying this building with her last $10, wondering if she should have taken a job somewhere else and saved money and come back later when she was more prepared, wondering if she was gonna fail. But Silas had known she would doubt, and he had written her a letter for exactly this moment. A letter that told her what she already knew but had forgotten in her worry, that she was not supposed to do this alone, that the Ferry house was not hers, that she was only keeping it for the next person. She thought about Caleb Shaw teaching her to shingle a roof, because he owed Silas 3 cents per ferry ride. She thought about Fletcher Kane glazing her windows because her father had saved his cousin. She thought about Fletch, the lobsterman, leaving buckets on her porch because his father had ridden the ferry for 41 years. She thought about Ida Shaw bringing groceries in a camp stove and a warning about carbon monoxide. She was not alone. She had never been alone. The community had been there from the first day, waiting to see if she would stay. And when it became clear that she was staying, they had begun to help in the ways they knew how. Not because they felt sorry for her, but because the ferry house belonged to them too. Because their fathers and grandfathers had ridden that ferry, and Silas Marlowe had kept the fare low and remembered their names and waited in the fog and the rain for the last passenger. This was a debt that went back 60 years. And Willa was not being asked to repay it. She was being asked to keep it, to hold it in trust, to pass it on. She went back downstairs and added a new entry to her list. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote, "The ferry house does not belong to me. I keep it for the next person." In August, a woman came to visit. Her name was Edith Bellamy, and she was 71 years old and had been a school teacher in Harlow Cove for 43 years before retiring. She drove up to the ferry house in a station wagon that was older than Willa, and she got out carrying a cardboard box and a determined expression. "I have curtains," Edith announced. "Every house needs curtains to tell the light when to come in." The curtains were beautiful. Edith had sewn them herself from fabric she had been saving for years, cream-colored linen, with a subtle pattern of leaves embroidered along the hems. They fit the windows perfectly, which meant Edith had measured the windows at some point, without Willa knowing, probably by asking Fletcher Kane what size glass he had cut. Willa tried to pay her, but Edith refused. She said Anne Marlowe was my student. 5th grade, 1937. She was a quiet girl with a gift for drawing. She used to sketch the boats in the harbor during recess. When she married Silas, I gave her a set of dish towels I had embroidered, and she wrote me a thank you note that I still have. She deserved to have someone living in this house who would take care of it. You are taking care of it, so the curtains are a gift. She would not stay for tea. She hung the curtains herself, adjusting them with the critical eye of someone who had spent 4 decades making sure things were done properly. And then she got back in her station wagon and drove away. Willa added her name to the list. Beside it, she wrote curtains. Student of Anne Marlowe. Remembers dish towels. The pattern was becoming clear. Every person who came to help had a connection to Silas or to Anne or to the ferry itself. They were not helping Willa. They were repaying a debt to the ferry house and to the man who had run it for 62 years without complaint. But there was something else happening too. Something Willa did not notice at first, but which became impossible to ignore as the summer wore on. The people who came to help were also coming to see, to bear witness, to make sure the ferry house was in good hands. Ida Shaw came every Wednesday like clockwork. She brought groceries and thermoses of soup and once a bag of clothes that had belonged to her daughter who had moved to Portland and left half her wardrobe behind. The clothes fit Willa well enough. But more than the clothes or the soup or the groceries, Ida brought stories. She told Willa about Silas Marlowe in fragments, the way you tell stories about the dead, when the memories are old and complicated. She said, Silas had been a quiet man who did not waste words, that he had loved Anne with a fierce loyalty that was visible to anyone who watched them together. That after Anne died, Silas had moved into the back room of the Ferry house and lived there alone because their cottage up the road had become too full of her absence to bear. She said Silas had kept a carving knife and a block of white pine in the wheelhouse, and between ferry runs he would sit and carve small figures. Birds mostly. Harbor seals. Once a whale. He gave them to children who rode the ferry, pressing the small wooden animals into their hands without ceremony. And then he would turn back to the wheel and wait for the next crossing. Ida brought one of the carvings with her on a Wednesday in late August. It was a seal, smooth and simple, about the size of a deck of cards. She said, "He gave this to me when I was 8 years old. I found it in a drawer last week, and I thought you should have it." Willa turned the seal over in her hands. The wood was dark with age and polished smooth by 60 years of being carried in pockets and held in hands. You could see the tool marks where Silas had shaped the flippers in the tail, but they were faint, worn down by time and touch. "Why are you giving this to me?" Willa asked. "Because you are living in his house," Ida said. "And I think he would want you to know that he was not just a ferryman. He was a man who made things with his hands, who gave things away, who believed that a small kindness could carry weight." She paused. Then she said, "I was angry at him for a long time, for leaving the ferry house to a stranger instead of to family. But I understand now. He did not leave it to you. He left it to whoever needed it most. And you needed it." Willa set the carved seal on the shelf in the wheelhouse next to her father's compass. Two objects made by the same hands 64 years apart. One for her father. One for a child who would grow up to be the woman who sold Willa the ferry house for $10. The circle was tightening. The past and the present were pulling closer together. In the first week of September, Caleb Shaw came back with Finn and a length of white oak in the bed of his truck. He said the front door was rotted at the bottom rail and would not last another winter. And if Willa wanted to do the job right, she should do it now, while the weather was still warm enough to work outside. They spent the entire day building a new door. Caleb showed Finn how to cut mortise and tenon joints, the kind of joinery that had been used for hundreds of years, because it was strong, and because it would hold even when the glue failed. Finn cut the tenons with a back saw while his father watched. Caleb shaped the rails with a hand plane, the long curls of pale oak falling around his boots like ribbons. Willa helped where she could, holding pieces steady, while Finn sawed, sweeping up shavings, learning by watching. Caleb did not talk much while he worked, but when he did, his words carried weight. A door, he said, is not just a piece of wood. It is a promise. It says, "You are welcome here," or it says, "You are not." A good door knows which one it is saying and does not apologize for it. By late afternoon, the door was fitted and hung on new iron hinges that Caleb had brought from his shop. When it swung closed, it made a solid, satisfying sound, heavy and final. And when Willa tested the latch, it caught cleanly and held. Caleb stepped back and looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "That is a door Silas Marlowe would approve of." He and Finn loaded their tools back into the truck and drove away before Willa could find the right words to thank them. That night, Willa stood on the porch in the dusk and looked at the new door and thought about promises, about welcome, about the difference between a door that invites and a door that warns. She thought about the fact that Caleb Shaw, who by his own admission had been poor as a child, had spent an entire Saturday teaching her to build something that would outlast them both. She went inside and added another line to her list. Beside Caleb's name, she wrote, "Built a door that will last longer than we do. Believes in promises." The summer was ending. The nights were getting colder and the days were getting shorter, and the light over the cove was turning from the bright brass of July to the softer gold of September. Willa had been at the Ferry house for 6 months. She had $3,000 left of the money Silas had left her. She had a roof that did not leak, and windows that held glass, and a door that closed properly, and a well that gave clean water. She had a list of 23 people who had helped her, and she had repaid exactly none of them, because she did not yet have anything to give except her gratitude, which she gave freely and often, but which did not feel like enough. She needed a plan for winter. She needed firewood, and she needed a better stove, and she needed work that would bring in money, because $3,000 would not last forever. She had been living off Fletch Kane's lobsters and the vegetables Ida brought from her garden, and the bread Edith Bellamy dropped off once a week in a basket with a cloth napkin over the top. But she could not live like that indefinitely. She needed to contribute. She needed to pay her fare. The answer came from an unexpected direction. On a Thursday morning in mid-September, a truck pulled up in front of the Ferry house, and a man got out. He was in his 60s, broad-shouldered and weathered, with the kind of face that had seen every kind of weather and had stopped being surprised by any of it. He introduced himself as Earl Dutch and said he had a load of firewood to deliver. Willa had not ordered firewood. She told him so. Earl nodded. He said, "I know. But Caleb Shaw told me you would need it, and he was right. So here it is." The wood was oak split and seasoned, stacked in the bed of the truck in neat rows. Earl backed the truck up to the side of the Ferry house and began unloading, stacking the wood against the wall in the same careful rows. And when Willa tried to help, he told her to stand back and let him work, because he had been stacking firewood since before she was born, and he knew how to do it right. When he was finished, he refused payment. He said, "I rode Silas Marlowe's ferry when I was a boy. My grandmother lived on the far side of the cove, and I used to visit her every Saturday. Silas charged her a nickel, and me nothing. He said children did not pay until their feet could touch the deck without the boat rocking under them. I never did pay. So this is the fare I owe." He got back in his truck and drove away before Willa could argue. She stood looking at the firewood for a long time. It was stacked perfectly, the smallest pieces on the outside, so the stack would not collapse, a gap of 2 inches between the bottom row and the ground to let air circulate and keep the wood dry. It was the kind of work that spoke of care and experience and a belief that things should be done properly. even when no one was watching. That evening, Willa sat on the porch and watched the sun go down over the cove and thought about fares. About the fact that Earl Dutch had been carrying the debt of a free ferry ride for 50 years and had finally found a way to pay it. About the fact that every person who had helped her was paying a fare that was decades old, a debt to a man who had died before Willa was born. And she understood finally what Silas had meant when he said that everyone pays their fare and everyone gets across. The ferry house was not just a building. It was a ledger, a record of debts given and debts paid, a place where kindness accumulated over time until it became something larger than any one person. A current that carried you across even when you did not know you needed carrying. She went inside and opened the compass cabinet and took out the fourth letter. On the front it said, "When you need more than money." She opened it. The letter inside was dated June 16th, 1963. When you need more than money, and you will because money runs out, but community does not. Look under the 7th floorboard from the door in the wheelhouse. There is a small metal box. The combination is 1901, the year the ferry began. Inside is not money. It is connection. A list of 58 families who rode the ferry on the last day, June 14th, 1963. I wrote down their names and their addresses and the names of their children if I knew them. Some of them have moved away. Some of them have died. But their children remember. Their grandchildren remember. They owe the ferry house, not money, memory. Call them. Write to them. Tell them the ferry house is still here. Ask them if they want it to stay. Do not ask for money. Ask for commitment. SCM. Willa climbed the stairs to the wheelhouse. She counted 7 boards from the door and knelt down and pried up the board with a screwdriver. Underneath, fitted into the space between the joists, was a small metal box with a combination lock. She dialed 1901 and the lock clicked open. Inside was a ledger. A small leather-bound book with pages yellowed by time. On the first page in Silas Marlowe's handwriting it said, "Last run, June 14th, 1963. Below that was a list of names. 58 families. Beside each name was an address, a telephone number if Silas had known it, and notes about children or grandchildren or other details Silas had remembered. Willa sat on the floor of the wheelhouse and read through the list. Some of the names she recognized. Earl Dutch was there. Caleb Shaw's father was there. Fletch Kane's father was there. Edith Bellamy was there, listed as Miss Edith Crane before she married. And near the bottom of the list, one name made Willa's breath catch in her throat. Thomas Patterson and family. Address in Lowell, Massachusetts. Note, deckhand on the ferry, summer 1962. Good man. Steady hands. Thomas Patterson. Nell Patterson's husband. The man who had died of a heart attack loading trucks at the Cisco depot. The man whose widow had given Willa $20 and a newspaper and sent her to Maine. Nell had not sent Willa here by accident. Nell had known about the ferry house, had known about Silas Marlowe. Her husband had worked the ferry, had been on the last run, and Nell had kept that knowledge to herself and had waited for the right moment to pass it on. Willa sat very still. The weight of it was almost too much. The fact that all of this, every piece of it, had been set in motion 61 years ago by a man who believed that a waiting place was worth preserving, that the people who had ridden his ferry would remember, that their children would remember, that when the time came they would answer the call. She spent the next 2 weeks finding the families on Silas's list. She used the telephone at the general store, and she used the addresses to send letters, and she used the internet at the library in Rockland to search for names and descendants. Of the 58 families, she found 41. 17 had moved and left no forwarding information, or had died without children, or had simply vanished into the decades. But 41 answered. Some sent money, $50, 100, 500. One family in Bar Harbor sent a check for $1,000 with a note that said, "My grandfather rode that ferry every day for 30 years. This is the fare he would want me to pay." Some sent supplies, books for a library, tools for repairs, a used generator, a Wi-Fi router, blankets and dishes, and a set of good kitchen knives. Some came in person. An elderly couple drove up from Portland and spent an afternoon walking the ferry slip and the waiting room, touching the walls, crying quietly, remembering. A middle-aged woman came from Bangor with her 2 children and told them about their great-grandfather, who had been the ferry engineer and who had kept the engine running in weather that should have kept the boat in harbor. And one person sent a letter that made everything else make sense. The letter came from Lowell, Massachusetts. It was written in a shaky hand on lined paper, torn from a spiral notebook. It said, "Dear Willa, my name is Nell Patterson. You know me already, but you do not know this part. My husband, Thomas, worked the Harlow Cove ferry in the summer of 1962. He was 19 years old and saving money for our wedding. Silas Marlowe taught him how to handle the boat and how to read the water and how to wait patiently for the right moment to make the crossing. Thomas loved that ferry. He talked about it for 40 years. He said Silas was the best man he ever worked for, fair and patient and never in a hurry. When Thomas died, I thought about going back to Harlow Cove to see the ferry house one more time, but I could not. I was afraid it would hurt too much. And then you walked into my diner, soaking wet, looking for work. And I saw something in you that reminded me of Thomas when he was young. That same quiet determination, that same refusal to quit. I did not send you to Maine by accident. I sent you because I owed Thomas the trip I never took. And I owed Silas the chance to help someone one more time. I am enclosing $500. It is not much, but it is what I can spare. Use it to keep the ferry house standing. That is all Thomas would want. Thank you for finishing what I could not start. Nell Patterson. Willa folded the letter and put it in the compass cabinet with the others. Then she sat on the floor and cried for the first time since her mother died. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming weight of being seen, of being chosen, of being part of a current that stretched back 60 years and would stretch forward 60 more if she did her job right. When she had finished crying, she went downstairs and added Nell Patterson's name to her list. Beside it, she wrote, "Sent me here. Husband worked the ferry. Finished what she could not start." By the end of September, Willa had collected $6,240 from the families on Silas's list. Combined with the $3,000 she had left, she had enough to make it through the winter. Enough to buy a proper wood stove and firewood and warm clothes and boots that did not leak. Enough to start thinking about what came next. But the money was not the important part. The important part was the connections. The 41 families who had answered Silas's call were now connected to Willa. They sent her emails and letters. They called to check on her progress. They told her stories about their parents and grandparents and the Ferry and Silas and Anne. They sent photographs. They sent memories. The Ferry house was no longer just Willa's project. It was theirs. A collective act of remembrance. A way to pay forward the kindness Silas had shown their families 6 decades ago. And Willa understood finally what Silas had been building all those years. Not just a ferry service, but a web of connection. A community held together by the simple act of carrying people across water and remembering their names and charging them fairly and waiting for them when they were late. That web had not broken when the ferry stopped running. It had only gone dormant. And now, 61 years later, it was coming back to life. October came to Harlow Cove the way it always came, with cold mornings and brilliant afternoons, and a light that turned the water from gray to gold and back again. The maples on the inland hills blazed orange and red, and the air smelled like wood smoke and salt, and the particular sharpness that comes before the first frost. Willa had been living in the ferry house for 7 months. The building no longer felt abandoned. The roof was sound and the windows were clean, and the door hung straight in its frame. Inside, the pot-bellied stove in the waiting room worked properly, and the small iron stove in the back room kept her warm through the increasingly cold nights. She had a mattress now, a real one that Ida Shaw had found at an estate sale in Rockland, and wool blankets that Edith Bellamy had brought down in a canvas bag with a note that said these had belonged to her mother. The well gave steady water, and Willa had learned to work the hand pump without thinking about it. The same way you learn to breathe or walk after doing it enough times. She had stacked the firewood Earl Dutch had brought along the south wall of the porch in careful rows, exactly the way he had shown her. And she added to it each week with wood she split herself using a maul she had bought from Albert Greer at the general store. She had learned that splitting wood was harder than it looked, but satisfying in a way that surprised her. There was a rhythm to it, a clean mechanical simplicity. You set the log on the block, you raised the maul, you brought it down in the center with all your weight behind it, and if you did it right, the wood split cleanly and fell away in 2 pieces. If you did it wrong, the maul stuck in the wood and you had to work it free and try again. Her hands had grown calloused from the work. Her arms had grown stronger. She looked different than she had 7 months ago. Leaner, harder. Her skin was darker from the sun, and her hair had grown past her shoulders and she kept it tied back with a piece of twine, because she did not own a proper hair tie and had not thought to buy one. She had money now, carefully saved from what the Ferry house families had sent and from the work she had started doing around town. She cleaned Albert Greer's store twice a week for $20 a session. She helped Edith Bellamy with yard work on Saturdays for another $20. She mended clothes for people who heard she could sew, charging $5 to hem a pair of pants or repair a torn jacket. And the work came in steadily enough that she was starting to think about buying a sewing machine. Not her mother's Singer. That was gone. Sold to a woman in Chelmsford for $80 when Willa had needed bus fare more than she needed sentiment. But maybe a newer machine, something electric, something she could use to do more than just mending. She was thinking about the future now in a way she had not been able to think about it in Lowell. In Lowell, the future had been a wall she kept running into, a series of closed doors and unpaid bills, and the constant low-grade anxiety of not knowing where she would sleep or what would happen next. Here, the future felt like something she could build, something she could shape with her own hands, if she was patient enough and worked hard enough, and asked for help when she needed it. But there was something else she needed to think about, something that had been growing in the back of her mind for weeks, and that she could no longer ignore. The Ferry house could not just be a place where she lived. It needed to be something more, something useful, something that justified all the help she had been given, and all the money that had been sent, and all the faith that people had placed in her when they told her to keep the building standing. Silas had run a ferry. That was his contribution. He had carried people across water for 62 years, and in doing so, he had created the web of connection that now supported Willa. But there was no ferry anymore, and there would not be again. The bridge had made the ferry obsolete. The ferry slip below the building was rotted beyond repair, and even if it were not, Willa did not have a boat and did not know how to pilot one. So what could the Ferry house become? She thought about it while she split wood, while she hauled water, while she lay in bed at night listening to the wind come off the cove and rattle the new windows that Fletcher Kane had glazed with such care. She thought about what Harlow Cove needed, and what she could provide, and where those two things might overlap. The answer came to her on a Tuesday in mid-October, when Ida Shaw stopped by with groceries and news that the town library had closed. The library had been a small building on the main road, just 3 rooms and maybe 2,000 books, run by a volunteer named Margaret Cross, who had finally decided at 83 that she was too old to keep climbing the stairs to open the building every morning. The town had no money to hire someone to replace her, and no volunteers willing to take over the work. So the library had simply locked its doors, and the books sat inside gathering dust. "It is a shame," Ida said. "Margaret ran that library for 41 years. Now people have to drive to Rockland if they want to borrow a book. Willa thought about this. Then she said, "What if the Ferry house became a library?" Ida looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Keep talking." So Willa talked. She said the waiting room was perfect for it. Tall ceilings, good light from the windows, benches where people could sit and read. She could build shelves along the walls. She could ask Margaret Cross if she would be willing to donate the books or at least some of them. She could open the Ferry house 3 days a week, maybe more if there was demand. People could come and borrow books and return them on the honor system. It would not be a big library, but it would be something. A place for the community to gather. A reason for people to come to the Ferry house and see what it had become. Ida was quiet for a while. Then she said, "You would need shelves. Caleb Shaw could help me build them. You would need a way to keep track of the books. I can make a ledger, like the one Silas kept. You would need heat in the winter. That pot-bellied stove will not be enough if you are opening the doors to people. Earl Dutch brought me firewood. I can keep the stove going." Ida smiled. It was the first time Willa had seen her smile, and it changed her whole face. Softened. It made her look younger. She said, "You are starting to think like Silas did, like a person who keeps a waiting place. Is that a yes?" "That is a we will see. Talk to Margaret. If she is willing to part with the books, we will make it work." Margaret Cross turned out to be a small, fierce woman with white hair and bright blue eyes and an opinion about everything. She lived in a cottage near the church, and when Willa knocked on her door, Margaret opened it with a book in one hand and a cup of tea in the other and said, "I know who you are. You are the girl who bought the Ferry house. Come in." They sat in Margaret's living room, which was so full of books there was barely space to walk, and Willa explained her idea. Margaret listened without interrupting, and when Willa was finished, Margaret set down her teacup and said, "Those books have been sitting in that building for 2 months, doing nothing. If you are willing to take care of them properly, I will give them to you. All of them. 2,137 books cataloged and ready. You can have the shelves too if you can figure out how to move them." Willa blinked. All of them, on one condition. You name it the Anne Marlowe Memorial Library. Willa felt something catch in her throat. Why Anne Marlowe? "Because Anne loved to read," Margaret said. "She used to come to the library every week when it was still in the church basement. She would check out 3 books at a time and return them the following week. And she always remembered to write her name neatly in the card pocket. When she died, Silas donated money to buy new books in her name, $50. Which does not sound like much now, but in 1960 it was enough to buy 30 books. Those 30 books are still in my collection. I have kept them separate all these years. If you are going to turn the Ferry house into a library, it should be named for the woman who loved books and married the ferryman." So it was decided. Over the next 3 weeks, Willa and Caleb Shaw and Finn and Fletcher Kane and half a dozen other people from town dismantled the shelves at the old library and transported them to the Ferry house and reassembled them along the walls of the waiting room. The shelves were oak built in the 1940s by a carpenter whose name no one remembered, and they were heavy and solid and would probably outlast the building itself. Margaret supervised the placement of every shelf and the arrangement of every book. She had a system, she said, and the system mattered. Fiction on the north wall alphabetically by author, nonfiction on the east wall by subject, children's books on the low shelves near the pot-bellied stove where the light was best, reference books and local history in the wheelhouse upstairs where serious readers could work without being disturbed. When the last book was shelved and the last shelf was secured to the wall, Margaret stood in the center of the waiting room and looked around and nodded once sharply, the way a general might nod after inspecting troops. Then she said, "This will do." Anne would have liked this. The Anne Marlowe Memorial Library opened on the first Saturday in November. Willa had made a sign by hand, painting the letters carefully on a board that Caleb had planed smooth, and Finn helped her hang it above the front door next to the old Ferry house sign. She had polished the pot-bellied stove until it shone, and she had swept the floor and washed the windows and set out the benches and placed a small table near the door with a ledger, where people could sign their names and write down which books they were borrowing. She did not know if anyone would come. At 9 in the morning, she unlocked the door and lit the stove and sat down on one of the benches to wait. By 9:30, 12 people had arrived. By 10, there were 20. By noon, Willa had stopped counting. People came and browsed the shelves and borrowed books and signed the ledger and thanked her and left. Some stayed to read by the stove. Some brought their children. Some were people Willa recognized from town, and some were strangers who had heard about the library and driven from Rockland or Ellsworth or even Bangor to see the Ferry house that had been closed for 61 years and was now open again. Ida Shaw came with a thermos of coffee and a tin of ginger cookies her sister had baked. Edith Bellamy came with a bouquet of late-season flowers in a mason jar. Fletcher Kane came and did not borrow a book, but walked slowly around the room, touching the shelves and looking at the titles, and nodding to himself as if confirming something he had suspected. Fletch Kane, the lobsterman, came and stood in the doorway for a long time without entering. Then he walked up to Willa and handed her an envelope and said, "My father would have wanted this to stay open." He turned and left before she could open the envelope. Inside was $300 in cash. By the end of the day, Willa was exhausted and exhilarated and slightly overwhelmed. 63 people had visited. 41 had borrowed books. The ledger was filled with names and titles, and Willa sat at the table after everyone had left and read through them and felt the weight of what she had created. This was not just a library. It was a waiting place, a place where people came and found what they needed and left and came back again, exactly the way they had come to the ferry. The building was doing what it had always done. It was carrying people, not across water, but across time, across the gap between what had been and what could be. She added a new page to her list that night. At the top, she wrote the Anne Marlowe Memorial Library, opened November 2nd, 2024. Below that, she wrote the names of everyone who had helped build it. and everyone who had visited on the first day. The library became part of the rhythm of Harlow Cove. Willa opened it every Saturday and Sunday from 9 until 4, and sometimes on Wednesday afternoons if the weather was good. People came regularly. Margaret Cross came every Sunday and sat in the same chair by the stove and read and occasionally corrected someone who was reshelving a book incorrectly. Children came after school and sprawled on the floor near the stove with picture books. Fishermen came in the off-season and borrowed mysteries and westerns and books about boats. And slowly, carefully, Willa began to expand what the Ferry house offered. She started a tool library in the back room. People could borrow hammers and saws and levels and clamps and all the small tools that you only needed once or twice a year and did not want to buy. Caleb Shaw donated the first tools. Fletcher Kane donated more. Earl Dutch brought a whole box of hand tools his father had owned and said, "These have been sitting in my barn for 20 years doing nothing. Put them to use." Within a month, the tool library had 40 items and a waiting list for the good cordless drill that someone had donated. Willa also started keeping the Ferry house open on cold nights as a warming station. She stocked the back room with blankets and a camp stove and supplies and put out the word that anyone who needed a warm place to sleep was welcome. She did not advertise it widely. She simply told Ida and Albert and a few other people, and let the information spread the way information spreads in small towns quietly and efficiently. The first person to use the warming station was a man in his 50s named Robert Kern, who had been living in his truck after losing his job at the fish processing plant in Rockland. He stayed 3 nights and then found work on a lobster boat and moved into a room above the general store. But before he left, he pressed $20 into Willa's hand and said, "I will not forget this." Others came after that. Not many. Harlow Cove was a small town, and most people had roofs over their heads. But there were always a few who needed a place for a night or a week. People who were between jobs or between homes, or just between one version of their life and the next. And the Ferry house held them the way it had held Willa. By December, the Ferry house had become essential to Harlow Cove in a way that would have been impossible to imagine 7 months earlier. It was the library, the tool exchange, the warming station, the place where people gathered on Saturday mornings to drink coffee and borrow books and catch up on news. The place where children came after school, the place where older people came to sit by the stove and read the newspaper and not be alone. Willa had done what Silas had asked. She had kept the Ferry house standing, but more than that, she had made it live. And then winter came in earnest. The first real storm hit on the 20th of January. A nor'easter that the Weather Service had been tracking for 3 days, promising high winds and heavy snow and coastal flooding. The predictions turned out to be accurate. The storm arrived on a Tuesday evening with winds that howled off the ocean at 60 miles per hour, and snow that fell so thick you could not see 10 feet in any direction. Willa had prepared as well as she could. She had stacked extra firewood on the porch. She had filled every container she owned with water in case the pump froze. She had checked the windows and the doors and made sure the stove was drawing properly. But there was only so much you could do when a storm like that came. Mostly you waited it out and hoped the roof held. By midnight, the power was out across Harlow Cove. By 2 in the morning, Willa heard a sound like a gunshot and felt the whole building shudder. She grabbed the flashlight she kept by her bed and ran upstairs to the wheelhouse. The wind had torn a section of shingles off the south corner of the roof, and rain was pouring in through the gap, soaking the floor and dripping down into the waiting room below. She tried to cover the gap with a tarp, but the wind was too strong, and the rain was coming in sideways, and within minutes she was soaked through and shivering. She needed help. She needed someone who knew what they were doing. But it was 2 in the morning and the roads were impassable, and she could not ask anyone to come out in this weather. She went back downstairs and moved the books away from where the water was dripping through the ceiling. She set out buckets and pots to catch the water. She built up the fire in the pot-bellied stove and tried to stay warm, and listened to the wind tear at the building and wondered if this was how it would end. If the Ferry house would survive 61 years of abandonment, only to fall apart on her watch. At dawn, the wind began to ease. By 8 in the morning, it had dropped to a steady blow and the snow had turned to sleet, and Willa could see across the cove again. She put on every layer of clothing she owned and went outside to assess the damage. The roof over the wheelhouse was badly compromised. The section of shingles that had blown off was larger than she had thought, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet, and the underlayment was torn. Water had gotten into the framing. If she did not fix it soon, the damage would spread, and the whole roof structure could rot. She was standing in the snow, staring up at the roof, when she heard the sound of a truck. Then another. Then a third. She turned and saw Caleb Shaw's pickup coming down the gravel road, followed by Fletcher Kane's van and Earl Dutch's flatbed. They pulled up in front of the Ferry house and climbed out without saying anything, and began unloading tools and tarps and lumber. Caleb looked at the roof and then looked at Willa and said, "We heard you might need a hand. How did you hear the phones are out? Ida called me last night before the power went. Said you were alone out here and the storm was bad." We waited until it was safe to drive. Finn climbed out of Caleb's truck carrying a ladder. Fletcher had a toolbox. Earl had a bundle of shingles. They did not wait for Willa to thank them or to explain what had happened. They simply went to work. For the next 6 hours, they tore out the damaged section of roof and replaced it with new underlayment and new shingles. Willa worked alongside them, handing up tools and materials, learning as she went. Her hands so cold she could barely feel them, but refusing to go inside and warm up while the men were on the roof. By mid-afternoon, the repair was finished. The roof was sealed. The water had stopped coming in. Caleb inspected every nail and every seam and then nodded once and said, "That will hold." They came down from the roof and stood in the snow, and Willa tried to find words to thank them, but everything she thought to say felt inadequate. These men had driven through a storm to fix her roof, had spent 6 hours in the cold and the wind, had asked for nothing in return. Finally, she said, "I do not know how to repay you for this." Caleb shook his head. "You already repaid us. You kept the Ferry house standing. You opened the library. You gave us a place to come back to. That is worth more than a roof." Earl said, "My granddaughter checks out books here every Saturday. She is 7 years old, and she has read 23 books since you opened. You think I am going to let this building fall down while she still has books to read?" Fletcher did not say anything. He just nodded and got back in his van and drove away. Willa stood in the snow and watched them leave and felt something shift inside her chest. A loosening, a release. For 7 months, she had been trying to repay the debts she owed to this community, trying to be worthy of the help she had been given, trying to prove that she deserved to be here. But she understood now that it did not work that way. The debts were not meant to be repaid in full. They were meant to be passed forward. She had been given help when she needed it, and now she was giving help to others who needed it. And someday those people would help someone else. The current flowed in one direction, forward. Always forward. That night she opened the 5th letter. It was time. The Ferry house had told her so in the only way it knew how, by nearly falling apart, and then being saved by the people who loved it. The envelope said, "When you save them." She opened it. The letter inside was dated June 17th, 1963. When you save them, and you will save them, because that is what a Ferry house does. Remember this: I could not save Anne. I was not there when she needed me. I was running the ferry and she was alone in our house, and when the sickness came, there was no one to help her. I have carried that failure for 3 years. I will carry it until I die. But you are there. You are in the Ferry house. You are keeping the place that keeps the people. And when they need you, you will be there. That is enough. That is all any of us can do. Be there. SCM. Willa folded the letter and sat with it for a long time. Silas had not been able to save his wife, but he had saved everyone else. 62 years of carrying people safely across water. 62 years of being there. And now Willa was doing the same thing. Not carrying people across water, but being there when the storm came. Keeping the doors open. Keeping the fire going. Keeping the place that kept the people. It was enough. The winter deepened. January gave way to February. The library stayed open every weekend, and the warming station stayed available every night. Willa split firewood and hauled water and kept the stove burning and read books by lamplight when the power went out, which it did frequently, because the lines in Harlow Cove were old and the storms were fierce. In early March, Nell Patterson came to visit. She drove up from Lowell in her old Honda, arriving on a Thursday afternoon with the trunk full of boxes. She climbed out of the car and stood looking at the Ferry house for a long time without moving. Then she walked up to the porch where Willa was waiting and she said, "I had to see it. I had to know it was real." "It is real," Willa said. Nell nodded. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. She said Thomas would have loved this. He would have loved what you did with it. They carried the boxes inside. Nell had brought things from Willa's old apartment that Willa had thought were lost forever. her mother's sewing box, the wooden jewelry box that had belonged to her grandmother, a framed photograph of her parents that had been left on the dresser. Small things, precious things. But the most important thing Nell brought was a story. They sat by the pot-bellied stove with mugs of tea, and Nell told Willa about the summer of 1962, when Thomas Patterson had worked on the Harlow Cove Ferry. He had been 19 years old and saving money to marry Nell, and he had taken the job because it paid well, and because he wanted to learn about boats. Silas Marlowe taught him everything Nell said: how to handle the lines, how to read the current, how to wait for the right moment to make the crossing. Thomas said Silas was the most patient man he had ever met, that he never rushed, never panicked, just waited until conditions were right, and then moved. She paused. Then she said, Thomas told me that on the last day the ferry ran, June 14th, 1963, Silas gathered everyone who had come for the last crossing, and he thanked them. He said the ferry had been his life and their lives, and that just because the boat was stopping did not mean the connection was breaking. He said a ferry was not about the boat. It was about the people on both sides of the water. Nell reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph. It was old black and white, creased from being carried in a wallet for decades. It showed a group of people standing on the deck of a small ferry. In the center, tall and broad-shouldered with his cap pulled low, was Silas Marlowe. Beside him, young and smiling, was Thomas Patterson. I kept this all these years, Nell said. I kept it because it was the last picture I had of Thomas before we got married. But I think you should have it now. I think it belongs here. Willa took the photograph and looked at it for a long time. Silas Marlowe's face was stern, but his eyes were kind. Thomas Patterson looked impossibly young. Behind them you could see the other passengers in the water of the cove and the wheelhouse where Willa now kept Silas's letters. Thank you, Willa said. Nell stayed for 3 days. She slept in the back room on the cot where Willa had slept her first night, and she helped shelve books, and she sat by the stove and talked to people who came to the library, and she told them stories about Thomas and about the ferry, and about what the ferry house had meant to people who had loved it. On the morning she left, she stood by her car and looked at Willa and said, "You did it. You kept it standing. Your mother would be proud of you." Willa hugged her and watched her drive away, and then went inside and added Nell's name to her list one more time. Beside it, she wrote, "Brought the photograph, brought the stories, came home." In April, the community held a meeting at the ferry house to discuss its future. 47 people attended. They sat on the benches and on folding chairs borrowed from the church, and they talked about what the ferry house had become and what it could be. Ideas came from everywhere. Someone suggested adding a farmer's market in the summer, where local fishermen and farmers could sell their catch and their produce. Someone else suggested hosting monthly potlucks. A third person suggested using the wheelhouse as a meeting space for the town council, since the old council building had been condemned. Willa listened and took notes and did not try to control the conversation. This was not her ferry house anymore. It belonged to the community, She was only keeping it for them. At the end of the meeting, Ida Shaw stood up and said, "We need to make this official. We need to form a non-profit. We need to make sure the Ferry House is protected and funded and maintained properly. And we need to make sure Willa can keep living here and running it without worrying about money." There was general agreement. A committee was formed. Paperwork was filed. By the end of May, the Ann Marlowe Memorial Library and Community Center was a registered nonprofit with a board of directors that included Ida Shaw, Caleb Shaw, Margaret Cross, and 4 other people from town. Willa was named the director with a salary of $28,000 a year, which was not much, but was more than she had ever made in her life, and was enough to live on. The Ferry House had become permanent, official, protected. In June, 1 year after Silas Marlowe had written his first letter, Willa opened the final 3 envelopes. The 6th letter said, "When you succeed." It was short. Success is not the destination. It is how you open the door for the next person. The 7th letter said, "When you are lonely." It was a list. The names of the 58 families who had ridden the last ferry. Beside each name, Silas had written a small note. Something he remembered. A detail. A kindness. James Whitcomb always helped elderly passengers with their bags. Marianne Townsend baked cookies for the ferry crew every Christmas. Robert Chen taught my apprentice how to tie a bowline. The list went on. 58 families. 58 memories. Silas had not forgotten any of them. At the bottom of the page he had written, "These are my family, not by blood, by choice. Now they are your family too." The 8th and final letter was in an envelope that said, "For the next one." Inside was a single sheet of blank paper, a pen, and a note in Silas's handwriting. "Write your letter. Leave your money. Hide it in the compass cabinet. The Ferry House will wait. Goodbye, daughter of the sea. You did well." S.C.M. Willa sat in the wheelhouse with the blank paper in front of her and thought about what to write. Thought about what she had learned in the year since she had arrived with $10 in a canvas bag and a compass made by a man she had never met. She had learned that a waiting place was not about waiting. It was about being there, about keeping the door open, about holding space for people who needed it. She had learned that debt and gratitude were not the same thing, that you could not repay the people who helped you, but you could help the people who came after. She had learned that community was not something you joined. It was something you built. One act of kindness at a time. One door held open. One fire kept burning. She picked up the pen and began to write. "To whoever finds this. My name is Willa Grace Thornhill. I came to this ferry house in March of 2024 with $10 and nowhere else to go. Silas Cade Marlowe left me $11,460 and 8 letters. He taught me that a ferry house is not about the boat. It is about the people. About keeping a place where they can cross from what they were to what they will become. I am leaving you $700. It is not much, but it is what I can spare, and it is more than Silas left me in some ways, because you will not be starting from nothing. You will have a roof that does not leak, windows that hold glass, a library with 2,000 books, a community that remembers. The Ferry house does not belong to you. You keep it for the next person. Be kind to the building. Be kind to the cove. The gulls remember. The tide remembers. Ask for help. Accept help. Pass it forward. You are not alone. You were never alone. Welcome home. Willa Grace Thornhill, keeper of the Ferry House, Harlow Cove, Maine, June 2025. She folded the letter and put it in an envelope and wrote on the front, "To whoever finds this." Then she counted out $700 from the money she had saved and wrapped it in the same oilcloth Silas had used. She placed both in the drawer of the compass cabinet and slid the drawer closed. Someday, maybe in 60 years, maybe sooner, someone else would open that drawer. Someone who needed a beginning. Someone who needed to know that they were expected. That the Ferry house had been waiting. But that was not today. Today there was work to do. The farmer's market was starting tomorrow, and Willa needed to set up tables on the porch. The library was open this afternoon, and she needed to reshelve the books that had been returned. Someone had donated a new coffee maker, and she needed to figure out where to put it. She went downstairs and opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The morning was clear and cool, and the cove was flat and silver under the early sun. A single gull stood on one of the old ferry pilings, watching her with bright black eyes. Down the gravel road, she saw a car approaching. Then another. People were coming. They would borrow books and drink coffee and talk about the weather and the fishing and their children and their gardens. They would stay for an hour or two, and then they would leave, and they would come back next week. And Willa would be here, keeping the door open, keeping the fire burning, keeping the Ferry house standing the way Silas had kept it standing for 62 years. A young woman got out of the first car. She looked to be about 19, with red hair pulled back in a ponytail and a backpack slung over one shoulder. She walked up to the porch, slowly looking at the building the way people look at something they are not sure they are allowed to enter. Willa recognized that look. She had worn it herself a year ago. The young woman stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at Willa and said, "Is this the Marlowe Library?" "It is," Willa said. "Come on in." The woman climbed the steps. Up close, Willa could see that her clothes were worn and her boots were held together with duct tape, and her eyes had the particular kind of weariness that comes from not sleeping in a safe place for too long. "I heard you have books," the woman said. "We do. 2,000 and change. You can borrow whatever you like." The woman nodded. Then she said, quietly, "I also heard you sometimes let people stay, if they need a place, just for a night or two." Willa looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "What is your name, Bryn?" "Well, Bryn, yes. We have a room in the back. It has a cot and a stove, and it is warm. You are welcome to stay as long as you need." Bryn's eyes filled with tears, but she did not let them fall. She said, "Thank you." "Come inside," Willa said. "I will show you around." She held the door open and Bryn walked through, and Willa followed her into the waiting room where the pot-bellied stove was warming, and the books were lined up on their shelves, and the morning light was pouring through the clean windows that Fletcher Kane had glazed with such care. Outside, the gulls wheeled over the cove, and the tide turned and began its slow journey back toward the shore. And the ferry house stood at the end of its gravel spit, exactly where it had always stood, exactly where it would stand for as long as there were people who needed it. Willa Grace Thornhill was 22 years old. She was the keeper of a ferry house on the coast of Maine. She had been given a beginning by a man who died before she was born, and now she was giving a beginning to someone else. The current flowed forward. It always had. It always would. And the ferry house waited the way it had always waited for the next person who would walk through the door and find what they needed and become what they were meant to become. A waiting place is a kind of faith, and faith does not break just because the boat has stopped running.